What if your wedding night was not private? What if it was not about love or family or celebration, but about proof? In some conservative villages in the Middle East and North Africa, a bride's first night as a wife is not about intimacy at all. It is a test, a trial by blood, a ritual designed not to celebrate her union but to confirm her worth. They call it honor. They say it is tradition. But for the women who live it, it is a night of terror they can never forget. The ritual is simple in words but brutal in practice. After the wedding, while music still plays in the streets and guests eat in the courtyard, the bride and groom are sent to a small bedroom in the family house. They are not truly alone. Outside the door, mothers, aunts, and sometimes entire groups of relatives wait in tense silence. The bride knows what is expected. She must prove she is untouched. The proof comes in the form of blood. Blood on a sheet or a cloth, or a piece of fabric that will be displayed for all to see. The weight of this moment is unbearable. It is not just her future that hangs in the balance. It is her family's honor, her husband's pride, and in the cruel logic of the community, the reputation of generations. If blood appears, she is pure. If it does not, she is shamed, accused, and sometimes worse. In extreme cases, women have been beaten, cast out, or even killed for failing this ritual. The truth about anatomy, about how the human body works, means nothing here. Science cannot argue with superstition when honor is at stake. One story tells of a girl in rural Egypt, barely 18, trembling as her new husband closed the door. She had never been alone with a man before, never been taught what would happen. She only knew that if the sheet stayed white, she might die before morning. Her husband, just 19, was as frightened as she was. Outside, the women waited. Minutes felt like hours, and when no blood appeared, panic spread through the house. Her mother wept. Her father yelled. Neighbors whispered through the thin walls. The groom was humiliated, his family enraged. That night, she was dragged into the courtyard, beaten with a sandal, and taken to a midwife to check her body. The verdict was cruel and public. She was called a disgrace. Practices like this exist in variations across the region, in Egypt, Yemen, Morocco, parts of rural Saudi Arabia, and beyond. Sometimes it is called a virginity test. Sometimes it is dressed as a tradition of honor. In every version, the message is the same. A woman's value is not her mind, her heart, or her soul. It is a thin membrane and a drop of blood. Anthropologists who documented these practices often describe the ritual in hushed tones, shocked not only by the cruelty, but by the theatricality. Families would sometimes hang the bloodied sheet from a window to show the neighbors. In other cases, the groom's mother would burst into the bedroom, snatch the fabric, and hold it high for the crowd. Cheers would erupt. Music would play louder. The woman would emerge smiling because she had no other choice. But inside, she was humiliated because intimacy had been stolen, replaced with a public exam she could never escape, and for those who failed, there was no mercy. A bride suspected of not being a virgin could be taken for secondary testing by midwives or traditional healers, an invasive and often traumatizing procedure. Some were forced to confess to imagined sins just to survive. Others were divorced immediately, sent back to their parents in shame, or, in the most tragic cases, killed to restore honor. The system was rigged against them from the start. Biology does not guarantee blood, but the tradition demanded it anyway. In the dim rooms where these rituals take place, fear hangs thicker than the smell of incense or the aroma of the wedding feast outside. The bride sits on the edge of the bed with her hands trembling and her stomach tight, listening to the muffled whispers beyond the door. She knows the crowd is waiting. She knows that in their eyes she is not a person anymore, only a verdict waiting to be announced. For the husband, the pressure is just as suffocating, though it comes with power. He has been raised to believe that his worth as a man depends not on tenderness or love, but on proving that his wife is pure. He may be nervous, even frightened, but he is also the judge in a trial that should never exist. The family's honor, their reputation, and sometimes even the girl's life depend on a single drop of blood. Outside, the air is heavy with tension. Women murmur prayers or gossip in low voices. Men linger in the courtyard pretending to be calm, sipping tea or smoking in silence. Children sense the unease and are shooed away. Everyone is waiting for the door to open. If a blood-stained cloth emerges, The family erupts with joy. Women ululate, men fire rifles into the air, and neighbors join in the celebration. The bride becomes a symbol of pride, even though she had no choice in what she endured. But if the cloth is clean, everything changes in an instant. Accusations fill the air. Her parents are summoned. Neighbors gather to witness the humiliation. The words spoken in those tense hours can decide whether she lives or dies. Women who lived through this ritual describe a feeling of their soul leaving their body. One woman from rural Morocco said she felt like a ghost hovering above herself, watching a stranger being judged and touched for the satisfaction of the crowd. Another, from a village in Yemen, said she wished the earth would swallow her before she had to walk out of that room without the proof they demanded. In some places, if no blood appears, the bride is dragged to a midwife or an older female relative for a physical inspection. The procedure is invasive and deeply humiliating. Even if the midwife declares her pure, suspicion often lingers. If she is declared impure, her world ends that night. There are stories of young brides beaten until they confess to imaginary sins. Some were forced to name fake lovers just to satisfy the family's anger. Others were killed, and their deaths were recorded as accidents or illnesses. In rare moments of quiet mercy, a groom or his mother would fake the proof by pricking a finger and smearing blood on the sheet. That small act could save a life, because everyone involved understood the truth. They would never speak aloud. The ritual was never about truth, it was about performance. It was theater for the sake of honor, staged at the cost of a woman's dignity and safety. Women who survive carry the scars forever. Their first experience of intimacy is not tenderness or love, but judgment and fear. Some leave for the cities, determined to bury the memory, but the echoes follow them in their nightmares and in the way they flinch at the sound of loud voices behind closed doors. And even now, in isolated villages, the ritual continues. Smartphones and satellite dishes have reached these rooftops, but the old fear survives in whispers. Families still wait outside doors. They still pass judgment in a single night that decides a woman's place in the world. For some women, the ritual of the bloodstained sheet was not just a single night of terror, but the beginning of a life lived under constant surveillance and fear, because in these communities, a woman's reputation is fragile and one whisper can destroy her forever. After the first night, even if she passed the test, the memory never left her. She would carry it like a weight in her chest, knowing that she was never safe from judgment. Some women learned to act, to smile in the courtyard, to serve tea to guests, to play the role of the obedient wife while inside they felt like ghosts. They remembered the faces waiting outside the door, the eyes of mothers and aunts, the low murmurs of neighbors, and they understood that their body had been treated as evidence rather than as their own. In some regions, women began to quietly resist, but resistance had to be silent and careful because open defiance meant death or exile. A few midwives who had seen too many girls suffer started to secretly help them, pricking a bride's finger to create the illusion of blood, or using small vials of animal blood to save a life. These acts were never spoken of aloud, yet they became the only shield some girls had. Stories spread in whispers of women who survived, only because another woman chose to be brave in the shadows. But not all could be saved. There were tragedies that haunted villages for decades. Girls who were beaten, drowned, or pushed into the desert to die for the crime of not bleeding on command. Families would call these acts restoring honor, and neighbors would nod, because to question the logic was to put yourself in danger. Honor was a chain that wrapped around everyone, men and women alike. Men felt it in their pride, women felt it in their skin. Even husbands who pitied their wives often stayed silent, because to protect her meant to challenge the entire family and the unwritten laws of the community. The ritual also warped intimacy, turning what should have been private into a public performance. Many husbands and wives never recovered from that first night, living together like strangers joined by obligation rather than trust. Over time, some women escaped to the cities or across borders, seeking lives where they could breathe without fear. They told their stories in refugee shelters, in whispered interviews with journalists, and later online. They spoke of the terror, the shame, and the lifelong scars. Hearing each other's voices gave them courage. In some cases, their testimonies reached the ears of activists and lawmakers who pushed for education campaigns and the criminalization of forced virginity testing. But in the remote villages where traditions die slowly, the whispers of the old ways still echo. A girl might grow up with a smartphone and still hear her grandmother say that a white sheet is the heaviest burden a bride will ever carry. She will know that one night can decide her fate, that honor is a cage disguised as celebration, and that silence is the first lesson she will ever learn about marriage. Today, the world is changing, but the shadows of the ritual still linger in corners where modernity moves slowly. In some villages in North Africa, the Middle East, and rural parts of South Asia, the expectation of proof remains even if the exact ritual is less visible. A mother may still whisper to her daughter on the night of her wedding that she must make the sheet red, and the girl nods, even if she feels her chest tighten with dread. In some homes, the sheet is no longer shown in public, but the pressure has simply moved behind closed doors, where the judgment still feels like a knife at the throat. Women who survived the old ritual now tell their stories with a mixture of courage and grief, remembering the terror that lived in their bones and hoping to protect their daughters from the same fate. Some speak to journalists and human rights groups, explaining that the first night of marriage felt like a trial, a punishment, or a performance staged for everyone but themselves. Others post anonymously on the internet, finally letting out the screams they swallowed decades ago. Slowly, the conversation begins to change as doctors and educators explain that virginity testing is meaningless, that anatomy does not guarantee blood, and that forcing women into this ritual is both dangerous and cruel. Campaigns appear in cities, signs declare that honor is not between a woman's legs, and younger men in urban areas begin to reject the old ways. But tradition does not vanish overnight. In isolated villages where poverty and fear of shame run deep, families still cling to the ritual as if it is a lifeline, convinced that controlling women is the only way to protect their names. Some girls are still inspected, some are still shamed, and a few still pay the ultimate price for something that should never have mattered. Yet hope lives in the voices of the women who refuse to stay silent. They speak in courtrooms, in classrooms, in online videos that reach millions. They teach that love should not begin with fear, that marriage should not be a test, and that no one's worth can be measured in a drop of blood. Their courage chips away at centuries of silence, and every story they tell makes the ritual weaker. One day the blood-stained sheet will exist only in memory, a symbol of a time when fear wore the mask of honor. Until then, the world must keep listening to the women who survived and believe them, because their first night was not a celebration. It was a battle for their humanity, fought in a locked room, while the world waited on the other side of the door.